There's kind of a running joke in American culture about like when you were a kid, some families never went on vacation at all. Some families had like incredible vacations. They would go to the beach. Maybe they even owned a beach house, or they would go to Disney World. They would go to these incredible places, the Grand Canyon. And other people come from families where dad took them on tours every summer of Civil War battlefields. That's me. I'm that dad.
We always have an odd one in the crowd.
So it's kind of odd.
Decidedly odd.
Doesn't that strike you as a little bit odd?
No, that doesn't strike me as a little bit odd.
It's the Bob and Sheri Oddcast, the stuff we wouldn't, couldn't, or shouldn't do on the regular show. Now, here's the Oddcast.
You guys, I want to talk to you about Fort Macon and two things that happened at Fort Macon. And I know you're scratching your head and going, girl, wait, Fort Macon? Yeah, okay, so Fort Macon was built way, way back in like the 1700s and it's built on the coast of North Carolina, right at the Atlantic Ocean, because all these pirates like Blackbeard would come through the area. And, we were at war with Spain and France and Great Britain. There were constant raids by enemy warships. Blackbeard, the pirate ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was discovered in shallow water right off of Fort Macon in the Atlantic Ocean, because that's where like Blackbeard the pirate did a lot of his sailing and his plundering. Back in 1747, the city of Beaufort, which is this adorable little coastal town, was captured by the Spanish and plundered. And then in 1782, it was captured by the British and plundered. And it's this really cool fort. It's 5-sided. It's made of brick. It's incredibly sturdy and strong and well preserved. And two things happened at Fort Macon that I think, even if you don't give a damn about like history or anything, you're going to be like, whoa. So the first thing that happened was what they call the bread incident, because you cannot deny people their carbs. And the second thing that happened is what they did to fend off enemy ships. Back then, ships were made of wood. So they had this special kiln down. It was inside. So the fort is, enclosed. Picture a military fort. It's a 5-sided circle. Inside, they had this like kiln, and they would put these metal cannonballs in the kiln, and they would heat them until they were red hot. And then they would launch them at the wooden ships standing just off the coast. And then when the red hot flaming cannonball would hit the wooden ship, dude, are you not so impressed by how medieval and insane that is as a strategy?
Cool. Very cool.
I was so taken aback by that. And the thing about it is, like, when you imagine you're stationed at that fort, and that fort was in use all the way up through World War II. And it's just incredible to see the layers of history, right? I mean, the Confederates seized it in 1861, and, they fought like a mighty, mighty fight. But when you think about the soldiers that were stationed at Fort Macon, so when they were doing this back in with the red hot cannonballs, this was back in the mid 1800s, and they called it the hot shot furnace. So the cannonballs that they would put in this furnace were not explosives, right? They were just metal balls, and the furnace would get heated up to about 1,077 degrees. Okay. So the cold cannonballs, they would put them into what they called these shot rails at the high end of the furnace, and the cannonballs would slowly roll down over the firebox. And when those cannonballs that were directly over the firebox turned glowing red, the soldier on duty would pull that cannonball out with like some big tongs, and then the next cannonball would slide into place. Can you picture it? It's like the earliest kind of, think of like the way pinballs line up in a pinball machine, the earliest kind of automation. So the cannonball will come out red hot. They would fish the cannonball, the red hot cannonball, out with the tongs, the steel tongs, and they would carefully carry them up to the cannons. And then the gun crews would have these wads of like wet hay that they would cram between the gunpowder charge and the red hot cannonball, because it would have been very, very bad if it went off prematurely. and then they'd fire that son of a bitch at the enemy ship. And I don't care who you are or how brave you think you are, you're standing on the deck of the ship and a red hot cannonball slams into you. Yeah.
Sheri, I always love it when you do some light reading.
This literally, when we took some time off at the end of August, I was like, Kevin, I really would like to go to Fort Macon. My husband is the luckiest man in the world because not only do I wear sassy undergarments, I want to go to Civil War and Revolutionary War historical sites and battlefields. You guys tell me that he's not the luckiest man.
He is the
that has
luckiest
ever
man.
lived.
Lucky.
He's the luckiest man.
Yes.
I'm like, you would not believe what I'm wearing underneath these jeans. Now let's go look at where the infantry was housed. I'm going to come back and tell you about the bread incident, and you're never going to feel like you have related to ancient soldiers more. So one of the things that drives me crazy about the anti-carb movement, because I'm sorry, like there's a lot of stuff I can give up, but I am not giving up like freshly baked bread. Are you giving that up? I am not giving that up. My brother went on the Atkins diet, and that was what broke him. He would have confessed to murder, for a cupcake at one point because you just crave the carbs. We have heard our whole life, it goes all the way back to ancient times, that bread is the staff of life. And until the 20th century, bread was the main thing that people ate. Everything else was like a little extra, like a condiment. So you would get like a big ass loaf of bread, and you'd have maybe a small, would fit in the palm of your hand, little bit of stewed meat and some vegetables or whatever. That was what you ate. And when you were a soldier back in the 1800s, bread was the primary thing they fed you. So the ration back then, each soldier would get an 18-ounce loaf of bread daily, and they jumped that up to 22 ounces in 1861. So this is the equivalent of a modern loaf, like picture a modern loaf of bread from the grocery store. That would be your ration every single day. Now you would get other things too, but you were guaranteed to have that ration of bread. And at Fort Macon, at all permanent U.S. military forts and outposts, one of the things that you'll find in every single one of them, including the one that's in the Dry Tortugas, where My Name is Mud ended up, the Dr. Mudd ended up,
right?
You'll find these enormous brick bake ovens because they had to bake enough bread to give every single soldier stationed at that fort a full loaf of bread every day. It was really, really important. Yeah, it was a really big deal. So at Fort Macon, and I just thought this was the best Army story that I've heard in a long time. The soldiers became really pissed off at the quality of the bread at one point. Ooh. So here's what happened. In April 1862, during the American Civil War, a Confederate soldier was assigned as the bread baker for the whole Confederate garrison that was stationed at Fort Macon. And Fort Macon was under siege by the Union forces. I mean, they couldn't lift their heads up without musket balls whizzing by. And they were surrounded on all sides, and they couldn't get out. And even though the one soldier that had been chosen to be the baker for the whole Fort Macon had been a baker before the war, he could not get the job done. The bread that he made was like barely edible. And maybe that was because he was trying to make so much of it. Like, I can bake a loaf of bread. I cannot bake 1,000 loaves of bread. You follow what I'm saying, Lamar? Like, you're a really good home cook.
High.
Yeah, you're a really good home cook. But if I commandeered you and said, "Welcome to Fort Macon, you're now the cook for the entire garrison," you might struggle, right?
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
The soldiers were not having it. In fact, one of the soldiers was chosen by his fellows to make a complaint about the quality of the bread. And so the soldiers were becoming restless and angry because, remember, bread wasn't just like a thing that you had with your meal. Bread was their primary food. And they are under siege by the enemy army, and they are hungry, and it's hot as balls and humid as all get out. And they're sleeping piled up on top of each other, not knowing if they're going to live to see the sunrise tomorrow. And the bread is shit. So they were like, we're not, absolutely not having it. The the surgeon at Fort Macon in April of 1862, wrote a letter to the general and said, the bread is unfit to be eaten. And as medical officer, I earnestly recommend that no more of it be issued. It wasn't poisonous. It just wasn't good.
Good.
And you've heard the expression, an army travels on its stomach.
Yes.
Well, if what you're asking of these soldiers is that their primary nutrition is bread, you best get your bitch ass into that kitchen and make a loaf of bread. Okay, so the soldiers asked the commandant at Fort Macon, please fire the baker, dishonorable discharge. We've got a flour ration. Let us do what we want with it. I think they were ready to put flour and water into the palm of their hand and slurp it up. How bad can bread be that it is that unfit?
I'm trying to think.
But
He must have made some crappy bread. I mean,
garbage bread, right? Yeah. Now, the commandant was like, no. And if you visit Fort Macon or really any big, Civil War, Revolutionary War era fort, and there's some really cool ones up and down the East Coast that you can go to, you'll see that the officers lived very differently from the enlisted men. The officers had better and different food, bigger and more comfortable accommodations. What the enlisted endured was not necessarily really understood all that well by the leadership. It took like special leadership to really understand what was happening to the soldiers that were serving beneath you. So the commandant was like, no. And that's when the officers at Fort Macon said, if you do not agree to our wishes, we're going to take over the fort and toss you out. You guys, they were going to have a mutiny over the quality of the bread. And I've never felt more closely aligned to a 19th century enlisted officer or soldier than I did in that moment when I learned it. It's called the bread incident. And it was so massive and so big a problem that it was a distraction to the troops serving at Fort Macon while they were under siege with the human army. So in defense of myself, being the dad who makes the family go to military battlefields and forts, you went your whole life not knowing that story. And it kind of changes the way you think about, like we're the way we're taught history, we memorize dates and regime changes and presidents and battles. And, by like 5th or 6th grade, we're supposed to be able to tell you what the Monroe Doctrine is, right? Or what Manifest Destiny is and all of that stuff. But I swear, if every now and again they would pepper in a story like the bread incident, it changes your understanding that these historical events aren't just these boring things that happened a long time ago. This was people. These were young soldiers away from home and away from their families for the first time. And they were living, they didn't have amenities. Now, Fort Macon was pretty swanky, as, military forts of that era go. But they didn't have air conditioning. They were roasting. They were sweltering. They had no privacy. And they knew that their very lives were on the line. And they were so overwhelmed by all of that they were like, this bread sucks. And I'm not going to fight until you give me better bread. And don't you think, doesn't it give you perspective on the human quality of all of that?
That is what's missing in teaching history, I believe. There's a way to make it a little bit more interesting. Because a lot of stuff happened.
Yeah. And during that time, they used to eat, if they were traveling and they weren't in like a fort, they ate something called hardtack. And hardtack had salt and flour in it, and it was like a hard cracker that was thick, but it would last for months on end. In fact, many soldiers during the Civil War lived on it for months on end and ate little else. And if you did get some soup, the good thing about it was you'd stick it in the soup and it would soak it up, and then it would get a little bit of flavor to it. And that wasn't as good as, and that wasn't bread. That was hardtack.
No.
And so what they would do is, if soldiers had been killed on the battlefield or had been wounded, they would go through their things and see if they could find the hardtack, and then make sure they got some that didn't have any blood on it. That was one of the things that they would do.
Which is horrifying. But these were real people. And they could be goofy and silly, and they could be petty. So, like in July of 1869, there was an officer at Fort Macon named Major Brayton, and he was really ticked off by the fort's doctor, Dr. Coos. Dr. Coos was stationed at Fort Macon to be a medical doctor, but all he cared about were like birds and nature. He was obsessed with the natural world. And so the officers and the enlisted men were like, this doctor is terrible. Like, we need a doctor, and he's collecting bird carcasses. So Major Brayton wrote a letter to headquarters and said, Dr. Coos is an intelligent man, but his mind is engaged with the study of birds and fish. He is not practical, does not take an interest in soldiering, and when spoken to upon the subject, is inclined to be insubordinate, and to my mind seems to think that the post surgeon is entirely distinct from and should not be subject to the orders of the post commander. Think about the humanness of that. Like, think about where you work. Think about your family. Think about how irritated we all get when somebody on the team is not pulling their weight. And now imagine that somebody is the doctor for the entire fort,
important.
which is under siege. Yeah. Under siege by the enemy forces. And meanwhile, Dr. Coos said, by the way, he wrote another letter, and his letter was to another naturalist. And he said, I'll be sending in my box a few skins prepared by my steward, who, on general principle, is a numbskull, but with streaks of intelligence here and there.
So numbskull was a thing back in the 1800s?
Back then.
Numbskull was a thing. Yeah.
That's a riot.
And the kind of medicine that Dr. Coos was tasked with, like if you were injured in battle, and remember, this was a fort under siege, right? If you were injured in battle, there was a very small chance that they would be able to save your arm or your leg. So one of the doctor's most frequently used tools was an amputation saw, because there was nothing that could be done for you except to remove the limb. So here we have a surgeon whose big job is to amputate your limbs, and he's obsessed with birds and sea turtles, and you're coming in injured, and he's like, all right, let me rinse my amputation saw off. So no wonder the commanding officers were pissed off about it and writing to try to get him removed. But there weren't that many people that could come in and replace him. It's just a completely different perspective on what it was like to be in that situation. And some people talk a good game. They talk about like, oh, here's what I would do. And, this country needs a war. Is that what you would do, really? Because do you have any idea what it's like to be afraid every minute of every day for your life? And to know that if you get hurt, they're going to cut your leg off and the bread is crap. Like, put yourself in the position of these soldiers. Tell me where your head would be.
Yeah. It'd be hard to be ready to face the enemy with all that. It really would. That's crazy.
And their equipment, everything was like a fraction as lightweight and protective. Forget waterproof. Have you guys ever watched a show it was on AMC? Netflix has it now, but it's called The Terror. And it's based on the true story of the Arctic exploration to find the Northwest Passage, where the two ships got ice locked and the crews disappeared, and they to this day the mystery of what happened to the crew of the HMS Terror and the Erebus has never
Sherry,
been
I
solved.
should watch it, but the title alone kind of probably kept me away from it. But now that I know what it's about, I probably will watch it.
Oh no, it's so good. So this is a real true story, is that the British Navy was convinced that there was a passage through the Arctic that would allow them to get to the Pacific much more quickly, right? And they understood about the polar ice and all of that. But human beings are like um, arrogant. We think we know more than we do, and we make decisions based on the data we have, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it really wrong. No one's really sure what happened to the Terror and the Erebus, those two ships, because by the time the remains of the ships were found, they had been squeezed into the pack ice, and they were, splintering and crushed and damaged and completely empty. No crew.
Wow.
No one knows, right? So you think about like what it means to, especially back then, what it meant to be enlisted in the Navy or the Army, and what it meant to go into these environments where you didn't have enough of anything, like in the TV show version of this, which is called The Terror. And this has a supernatural component, by the way, because it's fictionalized. So heads up, if you're anti a supernatural component, then you can probably not watch The Terror. But they sea ice gets jammed up into the ship's propeller, and they have to send one of the sailors down to see if he can dislodge the ice. Well, they didn't have wetsuits. They didn't have diving equipment like we have now. They put the guy in like a canvas, it looked like a sewn together tent with one of those big, heavy brass diving helmet things, and submerged him into the frigid Arctic water to see if he could dislodge the ice. It's a really scary scene, especially if you're claustrophobic. But think about that. Think about that. You and a lot of these people ran away and joined the the Navy or the Army or whatever at 12, 13, 14 years old. It was really common in the British Navy to join the Navy as a ship's boy at like age 13. So this is the world you grow up in. And this is your life and death all the time, every day. You wake up every day, not sure if you're going to see the end of that day. You better, by God, figure out how to bake the bread.
Well, that's not that much to ask. It's
It's so
really
small.
not that much to ask. Good
I want
bread.
you both to be very honest with me. Okay, I want you to be very, very honest.
Okay.
We don't face like an onslaught of enemy soldiers every day. We're not ice locked in the Arctic. We're not afraid that a cannonball is going to come barreling through the window and take us out. We have jobs that are, we're very lucky to have the jobs we have, and we're comfortable and we're warm and dry and all of that. But at the end of a long day, if dinner pisses you off, tell me you're not really pissed off.
Something
Well,
to be said for that.
But I wonder that if we were put in that situation, whether we would adapt to it and discover some things about ourselves that we didn't know, some strengths we didn't know about. So that's a possibility as well, isn't it? I mean, these people were.
Well, that is true.
They were people who, I mean, life was harder, but at the same time, they found an inner strength to be able to get through a lot of that stuff too. So. Or not.
I hear
or
you.
Are we just wilt in the moment?
I mean, we're modern people, right? So we come from a different time.
Yeah.
And we can't even, like,
we can't relate.
we're not used to going without heat and air conditioning and running water, right? These are people of a different time.
I really like
Their
crushed,
lives were harder.
crushed ice.
You like crushed ice?
You know, I don't like
I
the
like-
cubes. I like crushed ice. So,
See,
I like
I don't like when
chewy
people
ice.
have crushed ice because then people want to chew that ice, and I don't want nobody chewing ice around me.
now, see, they didn't
See,
have this
look at you.
problem in Fort Macon.
I
Look
can't.
at you.
Listen, I can
This
do.
one-
Listen, bad bread's okay, but somebody chewing ice next to me, no, that's not going to work for me.
This one's over here. I'd like my ice crushed. And Lamar's like, please don't chew that ice, Corporal. We're not.
Yeah, that's what I'm
we're-
saying.
This kind of does prove your point, Sherry. So,
we're not, we're not cut out for this. And we have to remember that, that we, no matter how crazy things are today, and they are crazy, and in some ways our lives are so complicated, and the complexity of our lives makes it hard for us to live our lives in the moment because we're addled by technology and distracted by a million blinking and flashing things. And that would be hard on an enlisted soldier from Fort Macon if he suddenly got launched into this timeline and had to sit down and do your job, Max. He couldn't do it. It would look like witchcraft. Like he couldn't do it. We're not built for that kind of struggle and that kind of sacrifice. But I think when you know about that struggle and that sacrifice, you appreciate it in a different way. Like everyone's always like, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Stop for a minute and think about what that service meant. What it meant in 1862 and then again in 1962 and now in 2024. When you say to somebody, thank you for your service, what are you really saying? Did you ever think about that?
thank you for your sacrifice.
Thank you for
Yeah,
doing what
true.
I won't do. Thank you for being braver than I am. Thank you for risking and suffering hardship and being scared and away from your family and eating crap bread. Thank you. Because you volunteered for that and I didn't want to because I knew that I couldn't do it. I just think we have a greater reverence for our nation and ourselves as a people when we understand little things like your job is to make red hot cannonballs, or your job is to make enough bread to feed hundreds and hundreds of soldiers every day. Like it just changes it for me.
I wonder how they were baking the bread, and perhaps that had something to do with it because I'm guessing they didn't have a lot of little pans for one loaf. And the problem with institutional food is when you put it in a big pot, it never tastes the same as it does in a little pot.
Do you think the first
no,
few
it's so
loaves tasted
gross,
pretty
yeah.
good, and then you just got sort of more tired, and once you get about halfway through, you're not even throwing the salt in it, or I mean, you know what I'm saying? I don't know. Maybe if you get one of the first loaves, it might be better.
Well, when we finished with Fort Macon, the next thing that we went to was the battleship North Carolina down the coast a little ways. And one of my favorite parts of that was the kitchen. They had the coolest stuff. And do you know what they did on that battleship? They were serving in the Pacific Theater during World War II. They were under attack. This was not like Gilligan's Island. This was a battleship with loaded guns and tons and tons and tons of sailors. And they were being attacked by the Japanese at that time. In the bakery, they baked a birthday cake for every person on board's birthday.
Wow.
And you never think about that, right?
That's pretty
like
cool.
you never ever think about that. And when you go into the kitchen on the battleship, they have all these crew memories, all these signs posted up with crew memories, and the goal was to make friends with one of the sailors that was assigned to the kitchen, to the bakery, because then you could like get extra treats. And they would sometimes go like kind of off. They would take leftovers and they would turn it into pizza or donuts or whatever, which if you're a sailor and you're at sea and you're in constant terror for your life, man, a birthday cake or a donut is pretty awesome, right? And it was so hot on the ship, and there was so little ventilation. And especially for the sailors that had to work in like the boiler rooms and the engine rooms, it would get up to like 130, 140 degrees, and they would be there for the whole like 8, 10, 12 hours in that unbelievable heat, keeping it going. And so the ship in the kitchen had an ice cream machine. Because what can you do for sailors that are away from home and busting their ass and scared to death every minute? What can you do for them? But at the end of the day, they can have ice cream. If that doesn't just like tear your heart out to think about. Like, I know it's fun to memorize, what happened at Pearl Harbor, and I know everybody knows what a kamikaze pilot is, but I want you to picture a 17-year-old kid who lied about his age, joined the U.S. Navy, is scared to death every minute, but there's ice cream tonight in the mess, and what that must have felt like. And then tell me why.
I'm sure that
Tell me why you don't want to visit that.
you would find a way to compartmentalize what was going on around you. You'd almost have to, because if you lived in the horror of it, it would be very difficult. And that's why I was thinking that one doctor that was more interested in birds, maybe the human toll of it was too much for him to bear, and he just said, "I think I'm going to go over here and deal with birds."
I think you're right, Max.
Because
not everybody's cut out for it.
You're sawing off people's limbs. I mean, it is just about as barbaric. But they didn't. But they didn't know about germs. They didn't. There was a whole bunch of stuff that they didn't know anything about. And if it was between losing a limb and losing your life, you go, all right, fine, start to cut.
And it's sort of like cop humor. You got to find a way to, if you're, for policemen that run into all these terrible things and that they have to see. They have to figure out some way to deal with it, dark humor or whatever. So.
And when it's your reality, right? When it's what you know, like one of the reasons that I dragged my poor kids, and now, thankfully I'm married to someone who has these same interests. But part of the reason I would drag my kids to these things is because you're never going to understand the price of freedom until you understand the cost of freedom, right? That these are people just like you and just like me and just like your brothers who stepped up for this. I took a bunch of pictures on the battleship of these different crew memories because some of them were so like, wow. I'm going to read one to you now from a guy named Charlie Roselle, who was a water tender on the ship. So now you're away from home, you're in the Pacific. You have to be very careful about your letters. They opened every single letter before you sent it. And the military censors made sure that you didn't accidentally give away like your position or any of the plans. So you had no privacy ever anywhere. And you couldn't even write home and express like, this is where I am and this is what's happening and I'm scared or I'm excited or whatever. Like it was just so hard. But these sailors would have to find ways to make it human. So here's what Charlie Roselle said. He worked in the boiler room. And he said, the boilers have a steam drum above you and a mud drum below you. And the mud drums have covers on them, these sheet metal covers that you can take off to get into them to clean. Between the sheet metal cover and the manhole into your mud drum, they had a spot about 10 or 12 inches. So we used to get a piece of beef from the cook and some new potatoes and some onions, and we'd take some sheet metal and make like a baking pan, and we'd sit all that in there for an hour and a half, and it was just like roasting, and it used to be so delicious. This is on a battleship that's being attacked because people have to find a way. They have to find a way to live and have hope and be people if they're going to be able to survive that kind of fear and pressure. Wow.
To be able to deal with it. You've got to be able to deal with it. Otherwise, you just ball up in a fetal position and that's it.
My father was on a ship during World War II called the USS Mount McKinley, and I belonged to the Facebook group. And I love seeing the pictures of what life was like there on the ship and all the different departments that they had that were non-shooting a gun. The people that were working, they had then their people doing typing, and you had the other people that were doing communication, and the people that were deciphering the Morse code, and it was fascinating. It really is.
Listen to this. They had, because you don't ever think about it, right? Because we live such comfortable lives. We're not doing this. We're not serving and sacrificing. This isn't World War II. One of the things they had on this ship was a mechanical cow. So what is a mechanical cow? Well, when they would first set sail, they would load as much fresh milk and fruits and vegetables and everything as they could onto the ship, but it would run out. So they would get this mechanical cow and they would put powdered milk and water and pounds of butter into it. And it would take a long time to do it, but it would turn all of that into milk so that the sailors could have a glass of milk with their meal.
Really?
I never knew about that. Did you?
No.
Isn't that
No, I did not know that. It is fascinating.
Yeah. It's just so, like, when you know that, it changes the way you think about it. And then if there was enough milk left over from the artificial mechanical cow, then they would put that into the ice cream machine. And then it would be so exciting because they would have ice cream. The ship had a barber shop on it because you know how the Navy is. You best keep yourself looking tight if you're going to be in the United States Navy. And they had not just a doctor, like a sick bay, they had a full surgical operating room. And it had the medical area had a shower. And the sailors said that you didn't want to be sick, but it wasn't the worst thing because you could take a shower. And they tried to have fresh water for the sailors to have showers with, but that wasn't always possible. Sometimes they had to run seawater through the system. And here's something that nobody thinks about. You can't really shampoo and use soap with seawater. So they had special soap that was really nasty and harsh that you would use on seawater shower days. But you had to stay clean because you were living all on top of each other. And it was not tolerable for you to be skipping your grooming. The U.S. Navy will not have that. You will smell nice and you will look good and your hair will be cut. So, it's just a different perspective. And now I know you two are sad that I don't drag you on my military battlefield vacation.
I know I am.
I know. I wish we could go. Don't you, Max?
I do, yes. But I really do.
Yeah.
I
love looking at that stuff.
When I tell you it's so fun, I don't mean that in a way to make light of the sacrifices and the suffering. It's just really awesome. It's like a little bit of time travel. And some of these places, and this is the last thing I'll say, and Max will know this one's true. Some of these places, if you don't care about red hot cannonballs or artificial milk machines, you might be into ghosts, in which case allow me to recommend a visit to Gettysburg.
Man, that is one haunted place.
Tell them, Max.
They say it's one of the most haunted places in the world. And I'm telling you, as a kid, I went there because we went on school field trips and that sort of thing. I'm telling you, as an adult, I go there. The hair on my arm, the back of my neck, it all stands on end. There's something. It is haunted there.
Yeah. So I want to say thank you for listening, and a special thank you to all of our active and retired military and everyone who has a family member or family members who've served. Those people, we stand on their shoulders, what they gave up, what they risked so that we could be comfortable. And if you enjoyed this episode of the Oddcast, be here next week. Root canal is so much more fascinating than you. Kidding. I have a whole separate podcast for those kind of subjects. All right. Wow. Thank you for listening to the Oddcast. The fort is in Beaufort, and it's called Fort Macon, and it's a state park, and it's gorgeous, and you can go to the beach and run on the trails. It's amazing. And the battleship is in Wilmington, North Carolina. Shout out to all of our listeners on 1027 GNI. If you live there and you haven't been, pick a day when it's not too hot. I promise you it's amazing. We'll see you next time on the Oddcast.